bleeding hearts with nursing degrees are why healthcare costs are unsustainable. That is what Dr. Richard Caldwell said 43 minutes before a blind veteran's heart stopped in his emergency department. The fluorescent lights of St. Michael's Emergency Department in Philadelphia hum at 120 cycles per second, casting blue-white light across antiseptic scrubbed floors that smell of bleach and copper. Hannah Clarke moves through her night shift with the careful invisibility of someone who has practiced being unremarkable for 8 months now, long enough to blend into the institutional furniture, short enough that nobody remembers her face when she leaves. Her hands are steady as she checks vitals on the post-op patients in beds 3 and 7, her posture efficient but forgettable, her voice soft when she speaks to the residents, deferential in a way that makes them look through her rather than at her. She has been this person for exactly 243 days, and the distance from who she was feels like crossing an ocean with your eyes closed. When the orderlies wheel in the blind veteran clutching a tarnished challenge coin from Fallujah, her pulse hammers once, twice, 3 times against her sternum like a warning signal, but her expression stays neutral the way only someone trained in hostile environments can keep a face neutral. She recognizes him instantly. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb. Special Forces. The man who commanded her son's unit in 2019, the voice on encrypted phone calls explaining casualty reports, the officer whose name she was given when she took the assignment to this hospital 8 months ago. Surveillance. That was the word the Pentagon liaison used when they called her at 4 a.m. with deployment orders. Protective observation of a high-value asset in civilian transition. Do not engage. Do not reveal. Maintain cover. Her left hand trembles almost imperceptibly as she reaches for his chart, a tremor that comes not from fear but from the physical memory of shrapnel, the kind that ends careers, ends deployments, ends the person you were and starts the person you have to become. She steadies it by gripping the clipboard harder. 43 minutes. That is how long she has been on the clock before Dr. Richard Caldwell enters Trauma Bay 3 with the confidence of someone who has never been contradicted by anyone who mattered. His white coat is spotless. His stethoscope hangs around his neck like a symbol of authority that he wears the way other men wear medals they did not earn. His eyes scan Webb's admission paperwork with the speed of someone who reads only what confirms what he already believes, and when he looks at Hannah standing beside the stretcher, his gaze dismisses her the way a man dismisses a piece of furniture he does not remember purchasing. Status report, he says, not to Hannah directly but to the room, his voice loud enough to carry across the trauma bay where 3 medical residents are reviewing charts and a nursing student is watching from the observation window. Hannah provides it anyway, her voice steady and precise, 67-year-old male, vision impairment, presenting with abdominal pain, nausea, tachycardia at 104 beats per minute, blood pressure stable at 128/82. She delivers the information like data points, not like a woman who knows this man, not like someone who held his hand once while explaining why her son would not be coming home on the date promised. Caldwell barely listens. He is already looking at the EKG strip, already preparing his narrative before he has examined the patient, already constructing the teaching moment he plans to deliver. This patient is non-critical, he announces, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that comes from being wrong before and never having consequences. Stable vitals, no acute distress, probably gastroenteritis or constipation. This is exactly what I want to teach you all about. Dr. Caldwell gestures broadly at the residents, his hand sweeping in an arc that is designed to make him the center of the room. This is Nurse Clarke demonstrating how not to manage triage priorities in a resource-limited environment. The room goes quiet. Not the good kind of quiet. The kind of quiet where everyone's breathing gets very shallow and the fluorescent lights seem to hum louder than they should. Hannah continues her work without a flicker of acknowledgement, her hands moving to check the fall line already established, her posture unchanged, but she hears every word that follows like they were meant to be heard, because they were. When we waste resources on non-critical patients, Caldwell continues, his eyes fixed on her, we create bottlenecks that delay care for actual emergencies. We increase costs, we reduce efficiency, and we demonstrate the kind of bleeding heart thinking that has bankrupted 3 hospital systems in this state alone. One of the residents shifts her weight. Another clears his throat. The nursing student in the observation window leans forward. Hannah adjusts the monitor leads on Webb's chest with the same precision she would use if nobody had just suggested that her clinical judgment was not just wrong but was actively harmful to the institution. The challenge coin is in Webb's hand, clutched like a talisman, tarnished silver the color of old rain. She does not look at it. She does not look at him. She does not look at Caldwell. She just checks the BP cuff and makes a note and moves to the next task with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst, because she has, and this is nothing compared to what she has seen through a rifle scope in a place where the heat could kill you if the bullets did not. Caldwell finishes his teaching moment and leaves the trauma bay without waiting for questions. He does not expect questions. He is not the kind of man who learned to wait for feedback because he was too busy talking over it. The residents disperse, uncomfortable, and Hannah remains, finishing her assessment of the patient with the thoroughness of someone whose entire career has been built on the assumption that protocol exists for a reason and that following it is how you keep people alive. Webb's tachycardia concerns her, though. 67 is old for this kind of presentation, and the abdominal pain combined with elevated heart rate could be cardiac. Could be nothing. Could be the kind of thing you watch, the kind of thing that kills you at 3 in the morning because you dismissed it at midnight. She makes a mental note and adds it to the chart with the kind of clinical precision that would have meant something, should have meant something, if anyone had been listening. What they did not know was that Hannah had spent 17 years making judgments like this, reading patient presentations the way other people read faces, spotting the liars and the truth-tellers and the ones who were dying before they knew they were dying. What they did not know was that her credentials were filed under a different name in a different country, that her medical training included 3 months of combat trauma at a forward surgical team in Helmand Province, that her hands had held more lives together than most surgeons in Philadelphia had treated in their entire careers. But none of that mattered here. Here she was just a nurse. The next 40 minutes blur into the necessary rhythms of patient care, vital signs every 15 minutes, for fluids running, a basic metabolic panel sent to the lab, routine work that feels designed to make you invisible. Caldwell returns to the nurse's station 3 times, and each time he speaks loudly enough for everyone to hear, each time he makes sure his comments about inefficiency and wasted resources could reasonably be attributed to Hannah's presence. At 2:02 a.m., between his third commentary and the lab results, he appears at the vending machine in the break room while she is reaching for a bottle of water. She does not jump. She does not pull her hand back. She takes the water and turns, and he is standing closer than professional distance suggests he should be, his tie loosened, his expression the kind that men wear when they are about to say something they have practiced saying. The thing about this job, he says, his voice pitched low enough that it sounds like a confidence but loud enough that if anyone walked past they would definitely hear it, is that you have to understand resource allocation. Bleeding hearts with nursing degrees think they can save everyone. They cannot. His eyes lock on hers while he says this. Not looking at the vending machine. Not speaking to the air. Speaking directly to her, making sure she understands that he knows his insult was heard, that he meant it that way, that the public version was only the opening act. The ones who care too much are the ones who bankrupt systems and cost lives by redirecting money from patients who can actually benefit from treatment. Hannah reaches for a second water bottle. She does not respond. She does not correct him. She does not explain that care and clinical judgment are not the same as sentiment, that understanding a patient's need and having the skill to address it are not luxuries but responsibilities. She just holds the water and waits, the way people do when they are listening to someone they do not respect explain why their respect does not matter. You understand? Caldwell asks, and it is not a question. His voice carries the weight of authority, the kind that assumes compliance, the kind that has worked on every person in this hospital because nobody here knows who they are actually talking to. Nobody here knows that Hannah Clarke is not her real identity, that her credentials are partial, that her entire job is to watch a man recover from a war that nobody talks about while pretending not to know him. Nobody here knows that she has had a loaded weapon in her hand at 3 a.m., that she has made decisions that ended lives, that resource allocation took on a very different meaning when the resources were measured in ammunition and the allocation was measured in terms of the mission. Yes, doctor, she says quietly, her voice soft and appropriately deferential, her posture submissive in a way that makes him believe he has won, that she understands her place, that she will think about his words and perhaps improve her performance. It is a beautiful lie, told in the tone of someone who believes it, told by a woman whose entire career has been built on telling lies that save lives. She leaves the break room first, the water bottles in her hand, and walks back toward the trauma bay where Webb is lying in bed 3 with his challenge coin clutched in his hand, still waiting for someone to tell him what is wrong. And that is when the real nightmare begins. Nobody knows what is about to happen. The lab results are 30 minutes away. The vital signs are unchanged. The night shift extends ahead like every other night shift, routine and endless and invisible. Hannah passes a supply closet on her way back to the nurse's station, the small room where extra fur bags are stored and extra oxygen tanks and the boxes of trauma shears that wear calluses into your palms if you use them enough. She does not go in. She keeps walking. But she knows, already, that she will need that room later, that moment that comes when professional composure meets personal knowledge, when the mask you have been wearing for 8 months starts to crack at the edges and you need 3 seconds in a dark room to remember who you actually are. For now, she has a job to do. She has a patient to watch. She has a cover to maintain. She has a man in a hospital bed in Philadelphia who wears a tarnished challenge coin that means more than she will ever say, and she has 8 months of invisibility that is about to burn away like morning mist when the world learns who she really is. Dr. Caldwell intercepts Hannah outside Trauma Bay 3, his voice pitched loud enough for the 4 residents clustered at the nurse's station to hear every syllable. This is Grand Rounds teaching moment number 1, he announces, gesturing toward Webb's chart with theatrical precision. Nurse Clarke demonstrates how not to manage triage priorities by wasting resources on a non-critical patient when we have actual emergencies. The residents exchange glances. Hannah's jaw tightens imperceptibly, a muscle shift so slight that only someone trained to read threat assessment would notice, but her fingers continue their steady rhythm on the computer keyboard, entering vitals without pause. The data entry does not stop. Her composure does not crack. Caldwell watches for a flinch that will not come, waiting for the moment when a nurse accepts her place in the hierarchy, and when it doesn't arrive, his frustration manifests as a louder voice and a comment directed at Singh about some people confusing nursing with social work. The residents shuffle their feet. Nobody contradicts an attending physician. Nobody ever does. 2 hours later, Hannah approaches the vending machine outside the staff lounge, and Caldwell is already there with Dr. Singh, a second-year intern whose medical school loans total $287,000 and whose career trajectory depends entirely on Caldwell's evaluation. Caldwell's voice carries with deliberate clarity, bleeding hearts with nursing degrees are why healthcare costs are unsustainable. They want to turn every exam room into a therapy session instead of moving patients through with efficiency. His eyes lock onto Hannah's face the entire time, his gaze like a spotlight searching for a reaction. He is testing her. Prodding. Waiting for the moment when she breaks the way people always do. She feeds quarters into the machine, 4 of them, each one dropping with a metallic clink into the metal slot, and selects black coffee without acknowledgement. The cup dispenses with a soft mechanical whir. She walks away as if he hadn't spoken, as if the words had dissipated like steam before reaching her ears, and Singh looks down at his shoes with the discomfort of someone witnessing a power play he cannot interrupt. Caldwell's hands clench. Her refusal to engage infuriates him more than anger ever could. Anger he could work with. Anger he could weaponize. This complete absence of reaction, is something he cannot control. 2 shifts pass. Hannah maintains her rhythm, medications distributed on time, patient charts updated with meticulous precision, blood pressure readings logged at 801,400 hours, her presence in the hospital corridors becoming almost invisible through sheer consistency. But invisibility was always the mission. 8 months of becoming the kind of nurse that surgeons forget the name of, the kind that residents barely notice, the kind that blends into the background until the moment something breaks. The fluorescent lights hum their perpetual electric song overhead, and Hannah moves through the hospital with the practiced silence of someone who has learned that drawing attention is a vulnerability. Then Caldwell appears in the doorway of examination room 6 while Hannah is preparing equipment for Webb's cardiac workup. She is checking oxygen saturation monitors, calibrating the defibrillator pads, her movements precise and unhurried. Caldwell's presence fills the doorway like a storm front, his voice dropping into the register he uses for threats. "Nurse Clarke, if you can't follow departmental protocols regarding resource allocation, security can escort you out." His hand rests on the security radio clipped to his belt, a reminder that he has institutional power, that he can summon uniformed personnel with a single word. "I'm not making a suggestion. It isn't a request. It's a threat wrapped in the language of policy. It's an attempt to see if she will finally show fear, finally demonstrate that the hierarchy matters, finally acknowledge that he holds the power and she does not." Hannah sets down the pulse oximeter. She turns slowly to face him, and meets his stare for exactly 3 seconds, a duration long enough that it qualifies as a challenge. Her face shows nothing. No anger. No fear. No calculation. Just the empty professionalism of someone doing her job. She nods once, a single downward motion of her head, and returns to calibrating equipment as if he hasn't spoken, as if his threat has already been discarded like yesterday's newspapers. Her hands move on their own, muscle memory from 17 years of precision under pressure, checking the monitor's LED display one final time. Caldwell's mouth tightens into a thin line. His jaw works silently. He expected fear, or anger, or pleading, something human that he could exploit or control. Her complete composure unnerves him, and that makes him exponentially angrier. He leaves the doorway without another word, and Hannah continues her work without pause, every movement deliberate and controlled. But that wasn't the worst part. After he leaves, Hannah walks to the supply closet at the end of the corridor, closes the door with a soft click, and presses her forehead against the cool metal shelf for exactly 3 seconds, not 4, not 2, exactly 3. That is the only mercy she allows herself. Her breathing steadies. Her hands, which have held lives together in operating tents and trauma bays across 3 continents, rest against the cool aluminum. The trembling that comes is not fear. The trembling is restraint. It is 3 years of training to suppress every visible reaction, 3 years of maintaining perfect composure in situations where lesser operators would have already exposed themselves or snapped entirely. 3 seconds. Then she straightens, rolls her shoulders back, and returns to the floor as if nothing happened. As if the man who just threatened her with security doesn't have a medical student's understanding of how to manipulate institutional systems into weapons. As if she hasn't already recognized the exact moment when Caldwell will cross from mere humiliation into something more strategic and dangerous. She has no idea what is about to walk through those doors. 40 minutes into Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb's examination, everything changes with the sound of an alarm. It begins as intermittent beeping, the familiar rhythm of a cardiac monitor during routine assessment, and then it changes pitch to a sustained shriek that travels through the hospital like a warning siren. Hannah is at the nurse's station when the sound registers, and she moves before the residents register what it means. Before Caldwell registers what it means. Her body rises from the desk and begins moving down the corridor at the exact moment her conscious mind processes the data. Webb is crashing. His heart is failing from an undiagnosed cardiac tamponade, blood filling the pericardial sac, each heartbeat crushed beneath the weight of hemorrhage that nobody caught because he was classified as non-critical by a doctor who made that decision based on institutional status, not medicine. The code team arrives in 90 seconds. A respiratory therapist. 2 additional nurses. A resident who looks 17 years old. But Hannah is already there, her hands on Webb's chest, feeling for cardiac motion that isn't happening, feeling for the subtle vibration of contracting muscle and finding nothing but the flat stillness of a heart that has stopped fighting. The code team swarms around her, and Caldwell pushes through the doorway, takes one look at the flat line on the monitor, and begins calling the time of death in the clinical monotone of a doctor who has performed this ritual hundreds of times before. Hannah's voice cuts through the chaos. Flat. Certain. Get me a thoracotomy kit. Now. It isn't a request. It's a command. Caldwell turns to her, his face registering disbelief. Nurse Clarke, step away from the patient. We are not performing an authorized. 30 seconds, Hannah says. Her voice has changed. It has dropped half an octave, and every person in the room recognizes the shift immediately. If someone doesn't manually massage his heart in the next 30 seconds, he dies. Your choice, doctor. The silence is so thick you could operate in it. Caldwell's face goes white, then red, but he doesn't stop her. Too many witnesses. The liability if she's right would destroy him professionally. A wide-eyed resident thrusts the thoracotomy kit at Hannah, and she moves with surgical precision that belongs nowhere near a hospital nurse, opening the sterile tray, prepping Webb's chest with practiced efficiency. Her hands are steady as titanium as she makes the incision, her movement controlled and exact as she spreads the ribs with a retractor and reaches into Webb's open chest cavity. Her gloved hands find his heart and begin to massage it directly, applying firm, steady pressure to the organ, working it like she has worked it in trauma situations across the Middle East, in field hospitals and safe houses and forward operating bases where the nearest surgeon was 300 kilometers away and the alternative to her hands was a body bag. Epinephrine, she barks. A nurse pushes the medication. Defibrillator paddles. Charge to 200 joules. The young resident fumbles with the equipment. His hands are shaking. Hannah's are not. After 90 seconds of direct cardiac massage, 90 seconds that stretch like hours, that feel like the entire weight of the war between what should happen and what does happen, Webb's heart stutters beneath her gloved hands. Once. Twice. Then it catches. The monitor shows sinus rhythm. Regular. Steady. The trauma bay is silent except for the rhythmic beeping of a cardiac monitor and Webb's ragged breathing, his body pulling oxygen back into lungs that had already begun the process of shutting down. Hannah's hands are steady as she sutures the chest closed, her movements precise and unhurried, completing the procedure with the competence of someone who has done this more than once. But Caldwell is already backing toward the door, his phone in his hand, his eyes narrowed with a fury that has transformed into something darker and more strategic. He has watched her work. He has watched her save a life using a procedure that no nurse in Philadelphia General is authorized to perform. He has watched her operate with the confidence of someone who has done this before, and that confidence has just become his justification. The door closes behind him as Hannah finishes the last suture. The monitor shrieked. A single sustained wail that cut through the ICU like a siren, and Hannah was moving before the second pulse of sound completed its cry. 40 minutes into observation. Webb's eyes remained closed, his chest rising and falling with the ventilator's rhythm, but the numbers on the screen told a story his body hadn't announced yet. Blood pressure collapsing. Oxygen saturation dropping. Heart rate climbing past 140 and still accelerating. The kind of cascade that meant minutes, not hours. She didn't call for help first. Her hands were already reaching for the crash cart, fingers moving with the kind of muscle memory that comes from 6 combat deployments and 18 years of field medicine. The trauma attending 2 beds down looked up, but Hannah was already cracking open the emergency thoracotomy kit, her voice dropping 3 octaves into something that wasn't a request. Get me a number 10 blade. Betadine. Level 1 rapid infuser running wide open. A resident froze. Hannah didn't repeat herself. The steel in her tone meant move. She didn't think about protocols. Protocols were for people who had the luxury of time. Protocols were for people who hadn't held a man's heart in their hands while rounds fired overhead in Fallujah. Webb was in tamponade, fluid compressing his heart, suffocating it from the outside while it tried desperately to pump, and the only thing between him and death was 30 seconds and her hands. The blade went in beneath his ribs, a clean incision through skin and muscle, and she could smell the copper rising, the iron-rich scent of blood that meant she'd found the right plane. The attending was there now, moving fast, understanding without being told that this wasn't an unlicensed procedure, this was emergency medicine stripped down to its essence. Pericardiocentesis was too slow. A needle wasn't going to drain enough fluid in time. She needed access. Direct access. Hannah's fingers found the pericardium through the opening, felt the tense distension beneath her touch like a water balloon stretched to bursting. She nicked it with the blade, and dark fluid spilled, the pressure release instant and violent. Webb's blood pressure jumped. The oxygen saturation climbed. His heart began to beat with purpose again instead of the desperate arrhythmia of a fist being strangled. But it wasn't enough. The bleeding inside was ongoing, coming from somewhere deep in the cardiac tissue. Tamponade would recur in minutes. She threaded her fingers into the opening and found it, the source, a laceration in the right atrium where shrapnel from years ago had finally begun to shift, finally begun to bleed. Her hands moved on their own now, muscle memory taking command. She packed the wound with a sterile gauze, applied direct pressure, her fingers becoming the thing his body couldn't do for itself. "Push 1 milligram epi 4, she said to the attending, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "Type and cross for 6 units. Get me a thoracic surgeon, I don't care if they're in surgery. This man needs the OR in 5 minutes. The words came out as commands, not suggestions, and everyone moved. A nurse appeared with the medications. The resident was already on the phone, his voice urgent and clear. Hannah's other hand continued the cardiac massage, feeling Wed's heart respond beneath her palm, feeling it regain its rhythm grain by grain. 3 minutes. The sutures went in with precision. The incision closed. Wed's blood pressure stabilized at 94/62, low but rising, his oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal. The room had transformed from chaos into something that looked almost routine, though every person in it understood they'd just watched someone operate in a state of controlled violence that most trauma surgeons trained for years to achieve. Hannah stepped back. Stripped off the gloves. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was even. A nurse handed her a paper towel to wipe the blood, and she took it without comment. The thoracic surgeon arrived 43 minutes later, already scrubbed, already moving toward the OR. He glanced at the incision, at the sutures, at the vitals now stable and climbing. He said nothing to Hannah. He didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. She watched them wheel Webb toward surgery, his blind eye still closed, his body no longer failing. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm down the hallway. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical comfort. And then the moment dissolved, the emergency consumed by the hospital's forward motion. Hannah turned back to the ICU unit station and began documenting the event with clinical precision. Time of arrest. Procedures performed. Medications administered. Names of personnel. She didn't document her own role, just recorded the interventions as if they'd happened independently, equipment responding to necessity. It was incomplete documentation and she knew it. It was exactly the kind of incomplete documentation that could destroy a nursing license. But that wasn't the worst part. Dr. Caldwell was already in motion. She saw him through the glass wall of the Chief of Staff's office 2 hours later, his tablet illuminated in front of him, his finger pointing at something, procedural manuals, hospital policy documents, evidence he'd gathered like ammunition. His voice carried through the door in urgent whispers, his expression the particular focus of someone building a case. Hannah passed by without slowing, without looking, but she heard the words that mattered. Reckless. Unauthorized. Outside scope. Dangerous precedent. The Chief of Staff, a woman named Patricia Morrison, nodded along, her expression growing more concerned with each sentence. Hannah knew Morrison from the occasional board meeting, competent, cautious, the kind of administrator who made decisions by committee rather than conviction. Which meant Caldwell had leverage, some favor owed, some debt to call in. She continued to the ICU. Wed's post-operative monitoring needed her attention. Blood pressure every 15 minutes. Oxygen saturation trends. Urine output. The mechanical checkpoints of survival. She moved through them with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times, recording numbers that were all climbing toward normal, all pointing toward a man who would live. The first phone call came at 3:41 p.m. She didn't see it happen, but the timing was too precise to be coincidence. By 4:15, hospital security had received a call asking them to secure any records from the ICU trauma response. By 4:30, the State Nursing Board had been contacted with formal allegations of unauthorized procedures performed outside the scope of nursing practice by an employee identified as Hannah Clarke, RN. The second call went to the Joint Commission Accreditation Office, the federal body that determined whether hospitals maintained their certifications. One call. One carefully worded complaint about the dangerous procedural violations that threatened both patient safety and institutional standing, and suddenly St. Michael's was vulnerable. Suddenly there was an investigation to consider. Suddenly there was institutional pressure rising like water behind a failing dam. Hannah heard about the third call from one of the medical residents, who overheard Morris in her office speaking urgently to someone on the phone. I understand, but the board needs to review all her references and employment history before we can move forward. There are some gaps I'm concerned about. The resident, young enough to still find drama in institutional politics, mentioned it to Hannah as gossip. I think Dr. Caldwell's questioning her credentials. Something about her references being hard to verify. Hannah felt that information land like a knife finding bone. Her references were cover identities. Deep cover, military intelligence fabrications that looked real on paper but would collapse under any serious investigation by someone who knew what they were looking for. If the board started pulling those threads, if someone with the right access started checking those numbers and addresses, the threads wouldn't just break, they'd expose everything. The surveillance mission would become visible. The intelligence community would start asking questions. And her son Derek would become a target precisely because she'd failed to keep his unit's movements classified and contained. The suspension notice came at 5:12 p.m. Administrator Douglas Chen, a man whose hands trembled slightly as he slid the paperwork across the conference table, his voice apologetic but immovable. The room smelled of stale coffee and floor wax, the particular smell of institutional apology. The board has placed you on immediate suspension pending investigation, Chen said, his eyes avoiding hers. Dr. Caldwell has raised serious concerns about unauthorized procedures, and with Joint Commission involvement, we have no choice. You understand. Hannah read the document. It was competent work. Caldwell had been thorough. Allegations of practicing medicine without a license. Allegations of endangering patient safety. Allegations of violating protocol in a way that created liability. Each one carefully worded to be both technically true and catastrophically misleading. She could see how the narrative played. How a thoracic surgeon who performed an emergency procedure outside her scope of practice could be made to look like a danger rather than a lifesaver. She signed where indicated. Her signature was steady, the letters formed with the precision of someone signing off on completed missions for 18 years. When do I return my badge? She asked. Chen blinked at her composure. Most people cried at this moment. Most people protested, argued, demanded explanations. Hannah simply asked the logistical question like she was checking off her equipment inventory. End of shift. I'm sorry, Hannah. You saved that man's life. Everyone knows that. The paperwork doesn't reflect that, Hannah said, standing. But institutions rarely do. She left the office with the suspension notice in her hand and exactly 3 hours left in her shift. The badge would need to be returned. Her locker would need to be cleared. Her presence would need to be erased from the building in the time it took for the night shift to settle in. But the real problem was the cover references. The real problem was that her entire reason for being here, surveillance of a blind special forces officer who held classified intelligence, had just become compromised by a man too petty to understand the difference between a rule violation and a life-saving intervention. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And Hannah Clarke had just done the hardest thing she'd done in 20 years. She'd saved a man's life and walked away from it in complete silence, knowing that speaking up would blow a classified operation and put her son in the crosshairs. 3 hours. That's all she had before everything unraveled. The final shift was methodical. Hannah moved through the trauma bays at 10:15 p.m. with the same efficient silence she'd maintained for 8 months, updating patient charts in the ICU, checking vitals, restocking the crash cart in Trauma Bay 3 with fresh supplies arranged in the exact sequence she'd learned to arrange them. Epinephrine here. Atropine here. Defibrillator pads in the side pocket. Everything where it needed to be, every movement precise and purposeful, exactly as if she were preparing equipment for a mission that would never come. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical lullaby overhead. A monitor beeped somewhere down the corridor. Normal. Ordinary. Invisible. Dr. Caldwell passed her twice during those final hours. The first time, near the medication dispensary, his shoulder brushed hers deliberately as he pulled past without apology. The second time, outside Webb's ICU cubicle, she heard him speaking to a resident in a voice pitched loud enough for her to hear. The board has already begun their preliminary assessment. Nurse Clarke's actions tonight will be thoroughly reviewed. He was building the narrative, cementing her erasure into institutional record. Hannah did not pause in checking the 4-drip rate on the patient in bed 4. Pain is information. She filed it away. At 11:42 p.m., the hospital administrator, a thin man named Douglas Chen who smelled of too much cologne and not enough sleep, appeared at the nurse's station with a manila folder in his hands. "Nurse Clarke, could you come with me?" Not a request. A statement delivered with the kind of courtesy that accompanies professional death. Hannah set down her pen, logged out of the computer, and followed him down the corridor to a conference room on the second floor. The elevator doors closed with a soft pneumatic hiss, trapping them in climate-controlled silence. The conference room smelled exactly like it had when she interviewed for the position 8 months ago: stale coffee, carpet cleaner trying unsuccessfully to mask something older and more chemical. A manila folder sat on the table. Chen sat across from her and opened it with the careful precision of a man performing a procedure he'd performed before. "This is a letter of immediate suspension from the nursing board. Effective immediately. You are no longer permitted on hospital grounds except for this meeting and any future board proceedings." His eyes did not meet hers. They never do when they're reading from prepared statements. The charges are unauthorized medical procedures without attending physician supervision, violation of protocol regarding scope of practice limitations, misuse of hospital resources, and reckless endangerment. Your state license is being reviewed. Hannah listened without moving. Her hands rested flat on the table, palms down, steady as surgical steel. She did not defend herself. She did not explain that she had performed an emergency thoracotomy because a patient was dying and the attending physician was incompetent and every second mattered. She did not mention that direct cardiac massage is a validated procedure in emergency cardiac tamponade when the alternative is certain death. She did not say any of it because saying it would require her to reveal understanding, and understanding would require explanation, and explanation would require context she had no authorization to provide. "I understand," she said quietly. Chen's shoulders relaxed fractionally. He had expected argument, tears, pleading. He was not prepared for acceptance. "Your final paycheck will be mailed to your address on file. Please return your badge and access card to security before you leave the building tonight. Hospital liability insurance has been notified. There will likely be additional legal documentation within the week." He slid the folder across the table. It contained the institutional erasure, a letter from the state board, a letter from hospital administration, a statement from Dr. Caldwell regarding concerning patterns of behavior he had been documenting. 8 months of observation, summarized into a professional narrative of incompetence and danger. Hannah accepted the folder. Her mission had been to observe Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, to document his status and connections, to remain embedded in his proximity until senior intelligence operatives could determine whether he posed a security risk to classified special operations protocols. She had accomplished none of that. Instead, she had burned her cover, revealed her proximity to a high-value asset, and announced herself with surgical precision in the middle of an emergency that required that precision. The board chair had been right about one thing: she had violated protocol. Just not the protocol he thought. The walk downstairs took 90 seconds. The elevator descended with that familiar deceleration that meant submitting to gravity, a pull-down feeling in the chest that Hannah recognized as the weight of failure. The basement level of St. Michael's smelled like laundry detergent and the particular stale air odor of underground spaces. The industrial laundry window was operated by a woman named Rosa who wore her gray hair in a long braid and who had never looked up from her sorting in the entire 8 months Hannah had worked the night shift. Tonight would be no exception. Hannah had folded her scrubs after every single shift with hospital corners, the sharp, precise fold that required 2 creases perpendicular and 2 folds parallel, creating angles so sharp they could cut air. She did this the same way she had folded her dress uniform before operations, the same way she had folded flags draped across the bodies of colleagues who wouldn't need uniforms anymore. The muscle memory never left your hands. It lived in the fiber of the fabric and the bone of your fingers and the part of your brain that understood precision as a form of respect. She walked to the laundry window. Rosa was sorting contaminated linens into industrial bins, still without looking up. Hannah held out the pale blue scrubs, still warm from being pressed against her body during the shift. The fabric was a color that had never belonged to her, it belonged to the hospital, to the identity they had assigned her, to the 8 months of being ordinary enough to disappear into the fluorescent lighting and the beeping monitors and the casual cruelty of men like Dr. Caldwell who saw nurses as extensions of their frustration rather than people with hands that had held lives together. "Thank you," Hannah said to Rosa, though Rosa still did not look up. The scrubs passed through the window like an artifact being surrendered to a museum. The laundry worker placed them in a bin with 100 other pale blue garments, identical and interchangeable. The bin would move to the industrial washers. The detergent would strip away the scent of the hospital and the particular chemical smell that clung to trauma bays. The fabric would come out fresh and ready for the next invisible nurse who would fold them with precision and accept insults and save lives without acknowledgement. Hannah stood at the window for 10 seconds longer than necessary. The fluorescent light above the laundry counter buzzed and flickered, that particular high-frequency hum that only bothered you if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. She had been paying attention for 8 months. Paying attention to everything except the one thing that mattered. She was not just a nurse pretending to be invisible. She was a Master Chief Petty Officer pretending to be a nurse pretending to be invisible, and somewhere in that triple negation, she had lost track of her operational mandate. Upstairs, Lieutenant Colonel Webb was stable in the ICU. His blind eyes would never see the woman who had saved his life. His heart would beat in a rhythm restored by her hands, but he would have no context for that resurrection, no way to understand that the quiet night nurse with steady hands and composed demeanor was the same person who had shielded his unit with her body 15 years ago in Fallujah. She had completed that part correctly, the patient had survived. But the surveillance mission was compromised. Her cover was burned. And in exactly 3 hours, when the night shift ended and day shift arrived with their questions and their need to know who Hannah Clarke was and why she had performed an unauthorized procedure, the institutional machinery would begin its grinding process of erasure. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had let Derek's existence, Derek's single fact of being her son, compromise 8 months of operational security. She had let love become a liability. She had let the possibility of someone discovering who she was override the absolute requirement that no one ever know what she had been trained to do. In a career spanning 2 decades and 3 combat deployments, she had never made that mistake. Tonight, at an industrial laundry window in the basement of St. Michael's Hospital, with worn scrubs still warm from a trauma bay, the mistake was made. The compromise was complete. Hannah walked back through the hospital corridors one final time. Past the nurse's station where a new night shift nurse was beginning her rounds. Past the medication dispensary where Dr. Caldwell had brushed past her shoulder hours earlier. Past Webb's ICU bed where the blind veteran was sleeping peacefully, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm that her hands had restored. She did not pause. She did not look. The staff entrance doors opened to Philadelphia night. September humidity hung in the air like a physical presence, warm, dense, carrying the smell of rain coming from somewhere east of the city. The parking lot was nearly empty. Hannah moved across the asphalt toward her car, a nondescript gray sedan that contained nothing personal, no evidence of her operational status, no trace of who Master Chief Petty Officer Hannah Clarke had been before she became an ordinary night shift nurse for 8 months. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She knew who it would be before checking. The text from her handler read, "Director wants debrief. Protocol violation suspected. Your location?" She did not respond. She got in her car. She drove home through the empty streets of Philadelphia as the rain began to fall, drumming against the windshield like something that had been waiting for permission to start. The rain had stopped by the time Derek Clarke burst through the automatic doors of St. Michael's main entrance, and the lobby fell into the kind of silence that happens when something shifts beneath the ordinary world. He was 17, built lean like his mother, and he carried a shadow box of medals and ribbons like a man carrying fire. His voice cracked as he shouted toward the information desk, "My mom can't accept this. They can't do this to her. She saved a man's life." The elderly security guard, Robert Chen, former Marine, 23 years of service with the 1st Marine Division, looked up from his desk. He'd seen a lot in his life. Fallujah. Ramadi. The things that don't have names. But he'd never seen a kid walk in here holding that particular arrangement of metal and cloth. Derek opened the shadow box. The lobby lights caught the medals in sequence, Bronze Star first, catching the fluorescent glare. The nurse at the front desk glanced over and immediately looked away. Then the Silver Star, its silver face gleaming like water. Robert Chen stood up. His chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a soft thud. And then the Navy Cross, the one above all the others, the one that means you held the line when everything was burning. Robert Chen walked toward the boy, his shoes clicking on the tile floor in the rhythm of 1,000 military corridors. His uniform was security blue, not dress blues, but his bearing hadn't changed since 2004. He looked at the medals, then at the boy's face, then back at the medals. "That's a Navy Cross," he said, his voice steady. The voice of someone who had once given orders that men died following. "And 2 Silver Stars. Son, what's your mother's rank?" Derek didn't hesitate. He'd practiced this moment in his bedroom mirror 100 times. Master Chief Petty Officer. Hannah Clarke. Retired Special Warfare. The words hung in the lobby air like they were made of something heavier than sound. Robert Chen's hand moved to his chest, not quite a salute but close enough to count. His eyes went bright. Within 40 minutes, the hospital's main conference room filled with board members who arrived with the sudden urgency of people receiving phone calls from the Pentagon. A liaison was on speakerphone, a woman's voice, clipped and official, with a kind of authority that comes from knowing exactly how much power sits behind your words. She had Hannah's service record open in front of her, and she read it aloud into the room like testimony. Master Chief Clarke, 3 combat deployments to Fallujah between 2003 and 2007. Designated Field Medic, SEAL Team 3, Charlie Platoon. Documented 47 lives saved under direct fire. Shrapnel wound sustained protecting her unit during an ambush in Jolin District, February 2007. Honorably discharged after reconstructive surgeries. Current assignment, civilian protective surveillance, intelligence detail, classified operational status. She paused. The room didn't breathe. She is not a suspended nurse. She is a decorated combat veteran. And you have just terminated her from a position she was specifically assigned to maintain. Dr. Caldwell wasn't in the room. He was already gone by then, already in his office gathering his things into a cardboard box that looked too small to hold a career. But everyone who was in the room, the administrator, the board members, the compliance officer, they all heard those words, and they all understood simultaneously that something very large had just broken in ways they didn't yet understand. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb sat in a wheelchair at the head of the conference table, his blind eyes pointed toward the sound of the liaison's voice, and when the phone call ended, he reached out across the table until someone guided his hand to Hannah's. She was standing quietly near the window, still wearing her civilian clothes, still carrying that absolute composure like a weapon she'd learned not to put down. Webb gripped her hand like it was the only real thing in a room full of dissolving certainties. His voice, when it came, was steady in a way that suggested he'd rehearsed this too, or maybe he'd just been living with the memory long enough that it didn't shake anymore. Master Chief Clarke shielded my unit with her body during an ambush at the intersection of Route Michigan and Euphrates, Webb said, speaking to the room but looking at nothing. We were pinned down. She moved across open ground while rounds were coming in and positioned herself between us and the muzzle flashes. The shrapnel that ended her combat career kept 3 of my men alive. She did that for us. She did that because that's what special warfare people do. He turned his head slightly, sensing where Hannah was standing, and his jaw tightened. I don't know what protocol she violated. I don't care. I know that when my heart stopped, her hands didn't hesitate. I know that she broke rules because protocols don't account for the person in front of you who saved your life 5 years ago and was assigned to save it again. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens in rooms where institutional power has just been reminded of actual power, the kind that comes from willingness to stand in front of bullets. The board members looked at each other. The administrator's hands shook. The compliance officer closed her laptop slowly, like someone closing a coffin. But that wasn't what ended Dr. Richard Caldwell's career. The real destruction came on social media, where the internet moves faster than institutional accountability, where power that comes from influence crumbles when 3 million people see what influence actually looks like when the mask drops. Jennifer Acosta, a trauma nurse who'd watched Caldwell at the vending machine 2 weeks earlier, had her phone recording when he delivered his monologue about bleeding hearts with nursing degrees. She'd been standing 3 rows back, and she'd recorded every word of his voice dripping with contempt, every gesture of dismissal, every moment of him not seeing the Master Chief Petty Officer standing 3 feet away from him, buying coffee with the composure of someone who had been under actual fire in actual war. The video went viral before anyone knew it existed. 4 million views in 18 hours. The comments section filled with people who recognized the uniform, the decorum, the way Hannah Clarke had simply continued her work without reaction because that's what soldiers do when someone small tries to diminish them. They don't react, they just stay steady. The Philadelphia medical community is small. It got smaller. By the next morning, Dr. Martin Reeves, the surgical chief at Johns Hopkins who had mentored Caldwell through medical school and written the letter of recommendation that opened every door Caldwell had ever walked through, saw the video. Reeves had delivered 14 commencement speeches about integrity in medicine. He had published papers on the ethics of surgical leadership. He had built a reputation on precision and principle. He called Caldwell at 7:06 a.m., and the conversation lasted 90 seconds. Richard, I just watched you mock a Navy Cross recipient on national television. You humiliated a decorated veteran for trying to save a patient's life. I'm issuing a public statement disavowing your actions and withdrawing my professional endorsement. You're on your own. Don't call me again. Reeves hung up the phone. Within 3 hours, he'd posted his statement on every platform where Caldwell's video was circulating. The surgical community's response was swift and complete, a collective stepping back from someone who'd suddenly become radioactive, whose presence at any hospital would now generate complaints and legal liability. The board members Caldwell had called in favors from suddenly had scheduling conflicts. The state nursing board investigator read Hannah's actual service record and closed the complaint with a formal apology. The Joint Commission investigator interviewed the trauma bay staff, and their conclusion was unanimous: Hannah's action was justified emergency intervention. The ticking clock of institutional power had reversed its count, 90 seconds to dismantle what had taken years to build, and Caldwell found himself standing alone in a corridor he'd thought was crowded with allies. By Friday, St. Michael's Board of Directors held an emergency meeting. Caldwell's attending position was stripped. His scheduled surgeries were reassigned. His name was removed from the departmental website. In the medical community of Philadelphia, he became someone people didn't reference, didn't remember, didn't acknowledge at professional functions. His career didn't end dramatically. It just ended quietly, the way most things do when the light stops shining on them. He cleaned out his office the following Monday, carrying a cardboard box that had once held medical journals, now holding personal items. Past nurses who wouldn't meet his eyes. Past residents who suddenly had urgent pages. Past Robert Chen at the security desk, who watched him leave without acknowledging his existence. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.